welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers, where my name is Jim Wilson, your host, and we're speaking to Janice Daugharty, author of several different novels. And I want to start out by asking her about, first off, a little bit about childhood and maybe kind of segue into how you became a writer.
Yeah, okay. I'm from the rural areas of near Valdosta, Georgia. That's South Georgia, right on the Georgia-Florida line. I'm kind of sandwiched in between the Okefenokee Swamp and the interstate somewhere in there, Interstate 75. And I grew up there. I lived in Eccles County all my life. And it's where I write. It's the place, it's my setting, it's my home. I write about where I know. I think it's very important for writers to do that. We all know you should write what you know, but writing where you know is equally as important. If you don't have a place, you really don't, your fiction doesn't have that feel, well, the feel of place, but it lacks something, I think, that a lot of times so much is just generic.
Well, since you're on to place, I'm curious about whether place is always a good thing, or is it sometimes a bad thing? Because sometimes, for some characters, they want to get out of a certain place and go on to other things. Is it sometimes, can place be tyrannical at all, you think?
Oh, I'm sure that it can be, and I think that's very interesting. And a lot of things that I play with in my books, in my novels, and my short stories too, I always have this outsider, insider, outsider in my stories, or almost always. Somebody who's always lived within this place. There's about 300,000 acres here with 3,000 people in my county, flatwoods, fields, and swamps, and you kind of get walled in by these pines, and my characters are always hoping they can go somewhere else. They want to go somewhere else. They want to cut themselves free from this place, because it can be very binding, too. But that's something else I like to do, is bring in an outsider to view how we live, because I feel that I've always been an insider-outsider, an insider with an outsider's mind, interested in other people and other places. And you particularly see that, I think, in my novel, Paw Paw Patch, with Archie Wall, the old bachelor lawyer. He thinks of himself as an insider-outsider and not too much accepted in his community, and that's certainly true of the artist in these small, maybe all rural communities. I don't think this is just Southern.
Writer is outsider.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And that's also the outsider coming inside is also a function in Dark of the Moon. That same happens there.
Yes, that was my first published novel, and living in the community that I live in, which is predominantly Baptist, missionary Baptist, which I am too. And I was playing with, when I was writing Dark of the Moon, I was playing with learning to write erotica. I had been reading a lot of John Updike, very much an influence on my work, and I wanted to see if I could write that without any mushiness. I'm going to see what I can do with erotica, and not thinking it was going to sell, and it turned out to be my first novel that was published. And so, you know, I think that made me more of an outsider in my community, but I don't know that. You know, people are pretty wonderful there. It's a great place to live, and a great place to write.
So you don't feel like it oppresses you in any way? It actually is freeing to you?
It's very freeing to me, and I'll tell you the main reason it's very freeing to me. I mean, you can write yourself into oblivion where I live. My friend Virginia Lanier, who's another HarperCollins author, we're just across the woods from each other, and you know, we can write ourselves into oblivion, and nobody cares that we are writers, and it's kind of, that's wonderful, though. I mean, sometimes you feel like, my gosh, nobody loves me here, and they don't understand me, and they don't care about my books. But by the same token, there's a lot of freedom in that, too. It's very freeing, and you can just sit there and write.
Well, what you're saying about the 300, what did you say, 300 acres? 300,000 acres?
300,000 acres in Eccles County.
Almost sounds like Faulkner's, you know, writing. I mean, where he deals with the postage size stamp of, you know, of part of America, of his country. Do you feel there's any kind of heritage there, or
Faulkner was my first teacher. I learned to write by reading and by writing. He was my teacher. And of course, I was very much influenced by Faulkner's, and I'm not even going to embarrass myself by trying to say that county. I call it York County.
Yeah.
Because I can't say it. And so I was, what struck me, I think, first was seeing some printed words on the page that I never thought of as important and didn't think I had an important thing to say then his characters reminded me of my characters, the people in my home place, the types of people in my county. And then the layout of the county and his Frenchman's Bend and all this. And I have a very similar layout in my county, or maybe it just kind of assimilated itself in my mind as the same setting that he's writing about his fictional place. And I really, at first, didn't even know any better than to imitate Faulkner. That was a bad mistake in a way. But you've got to have a role model somewhere, so why not? And so then after I reached a certain point and I was getting published, I said, I do not care. This is what I write and this is the truth. And my novel, Earl in the Yellow Shirt, is a prime example. It was very successful in a way, got so much wonderful critical acclaim, and yet at the same time I was criticized for my methods that I used for telling the story, in which I have different characters telling the story from different points of view and different voices. And I actually did take that from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, because I thought, okay, I've got this story my dad told me, this wonderful story about this this old man who's very eccentric, and his wife has died. He's getting quite old. She's died, and he tells the grown children, me and your mama's done with one another. Y'all do what you want to about it. And what he means is put mama away decent or any way you can, as Lou Jean says. And so my dad told me the story about this man, and we laughed, and my dad is an excellent storyteller. And I thought, okay, I've got this story that's so similar to As I Lay Dying, and I think I'll use Faulkner's techniques, because by then it didn't matter anyway. I was just writing for myself, and these things were never going to get published. Because I read so many novels before I ever got published, and countless short stories. I mean, I cannot say enough for sticking with it. The only way you can fail to get published.
You said before that it took you had a 10-year apprenticeship of writing.
I called my apprenticeship, yeah. My 10-year apprenticeship, and that's very important to go through your apprenticeship gladly. I'm afraid I had, and this was good and bad, I had a New York agent almost from the beginning who couldn't sell a thing I did. But she was absolutely wonderful and supportive, and she was my link to New York, where everything's going on in publishing. Very important to me at that period. Otherwise, I might not have had as much confidence to go on. I wouldn't have believed in myself. She was sending out my stories and mostly my novels. I was writing about one every 6 months. You know, I was really working my head off. And some of them are so bad, I hope they never get published. But I would get these rejection letters back from the major publishers, from editors at major houses. And they would all say, never quit writing, you are wonderful, it's just a matter of time. And so that's what kept me going.
They still said, but we can't use it? Is that
that was the last line, but I just kind of would ignore that. And when I did ignore that, my husband would say, he would point it out, he would say, look how good this rejection letter is. A real contradiction.
It could have been worse, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
But you've also said that you had a fairy godmother, around too, besides this agent, other good people for you.
Well, that's how I finally got published. That's how, and since then I've been publishing ever since. I published 2 books, oh gosh, back in '94, I guess. And my fairy godmother was Joyce Carol Oates.
That's a good one to have, I would think.
Oh, do I love that lady. Not only her writing, she teaches at Princeton, and gosh, who has more novels out than Joyce Carol Oates? And her body of work is astounding. Mm-hmm. She has Ontario Review Press. She and her husband, Ray Smith. These lit reviews are one of the few places that a new writer can get published. But they also publish John Updike, and they publish the big names too. But there's a nice mix in there. Joyce Carol Oates read one of my stories back, I guess that was '94, and she loved it, and she published it, and then she asked me for another one. I sent her another one. I was euphoric for so long, I cannot tell you, it'll kill you. and then she said, well, do you have a collection? And I said, oh yeah, but I didn't. I didn't have a good collection. I was working as a librarian.
You fiction writers.
I was going to give up writing. I was going to give up writing, so I was working as a librarian for the first time, and gosh, so long. Never really had a paying job, and this didn't pay well either. And then I would work during the day at this library. I was working part-time, actually, 3 days a week. And then I would go home, and I would write at night, and write till 1 and 2 in the morning. Get up, get back to work. And I mean, you cannot believe what you can do when you're desperate, and you know this is it. You know this is your fairy godmother, and by gosh, you're going to make it to the ball.
Right. So that was that collection that you did. That was called what?
Yeah, Going Through the Change.
Through the Change.
Yes, I love that collection. It'll always be very dear to my heart because of her. She edited it, and Ray Smith, her husband, worked on it, and it was just it was a special part, very special point in my life. But I also love short fiction. I love to write short fiction. I like the novel too, the novel form. But that working with short fiction is putting me in a little closer restraints, and I've got to think about it a little bit more and be a little more careful in my selection of words. Not that I'm not in a novel. I mean, I'll go through and I've learned. I think when I got published, I learned to edit word by word, and then sentence by sentence, and then paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, or scene by scene, and then chapter by chapter. And when you really look at it that way, you're really focusing. Do I want the word a, or do I want the word the? And you're weighing out these possibilities. And language is where it's all at for me. I wouldn't want to write if I were not writing language. I'm not. Story's just there. Does something aside from it. That's in the margins. It's important. And maybe story does come first for me. That's not quite true. Story has to come first because that's what we're doing, is telling stories. But once I start working with language, I forget that.
So one of the things Henry James said about the novel is that it's a baggy monster. So moving from this short form, very constrained form, to this monster, he called it. What was that like for you? I mean, did you find it to be a baggy monster as well, or did you find that it wasn't quite so monstrous when you started getting into it? Did you find it was fairly easy? Yeah, novel
The
form.
novels for me are very easy. That's where I started.
Oh,
That's
you started
what
with
I've
a
always
novel.
done. I have now probably 28. That's how I learned. I learned to write by writing. I learned to plot by plotting. I learned, you know, my teachers are Toni Morrison and William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor and Marquez and Cormac McCarthy. Those are my teachers. Mm-hmm. And so I was more interested in the novel, and I think maybe probably because I thought it was going to be a great success and make lots of money. Right off the bat, this is going to be so good. And I was so proud of my baby, like everybody is, but my baby was just no good. Mm. And so that's golly, I have so many bad novels. But I didn't know they were bad, and that's okay because they taught me to write. But no, I found it much, much easier to stay with a novel, and you're working with, you know, you have a little more elbow room. You have more room to expand. The short fiction for me is still a real challenge, and particularly getting short fiction published.
So how do you get that language to rise to where you want it to be? How do you work on that? Or how do you get that to happen for yourself and not just be something that isn't exciting to you or maybe possibly to your readers? How do you do that?
Well, that's the hard part. That's the real hard part for me. I mean, the time-consuming part that I go through a novel very quickly. I can rough it out, maybe 6 weeks, 3 months, but I'm working, you know, night and day plotting. Then I'm going back. I write in longhand, then I transpose to the computer, and that's where I edit. And then I start making pretty sentences. And I go for walks, and I can walk for a whole hour to find that right word. I'm never happy. I'm never contented with a word. I'm never satisfied. There's always a better word. Mm-hmm. There's always a better way to say it, and I love words. I particularly like the short words that Cormac McCarthy uses so often, and the verbs. He's wonderful. But, you know, I work a long time on a good line. I tell people, when you read this, please read it slowly, because I spent a long time working on this. Don't just gobble it up. But it does. You know, to come up with a good line is very difficult.
Yeah. Now, one of the challenges, especially in a novel where you have a first-person narrator who isn't very educated and has not, you know, hardly any literary background, how do you get them to say those kind of wonderful sentences?
Oh my gosh!
That's such a difficult thing to do.
You know,
right.
That was a real. That was very difficult for me. I'm not writing much in first person anymore. Maybe that's the reason. But I did that in Dark of the Moon, my first published novel, which is in development as a Hallmark film. Dark of the Moon, I wrote this in this voice that I could actually hear in my head. She kind of wrote the story for herself. Murdy was the character. Country music singer, wife of an old bootlegger. A love story, the capture whiskey revenuer. and the fellows, her family, her stepson and her husband and her sons, they just don't have the courage to kill this fellow. So they capture him, and this is all written for fun. I'm just having a good time here and learning to write erotica and a love story. And they capture him, and then she falls in love with him. And I'm using her voice through this, and yet I wanted to make this magic, so I had to make her smarter. She's not educated. And I wanted to, there's a real, you're walking a real thin line there when you do that with a character who's not educated and wouldn't know poetry or, wouldn't be dealing a lot with language. And so I had to do it through her voice with the diction, using her diction. That's not easy. That may be the hardest thing I've ever done. It looks easy, it sounds easy, and you think, well, just do it in her voice. And maybe, I don't know if I didn't overdo it, but my love for language was coming through her. And that may be authorial intrusion, I do not know. But I kind of think it works in a way, and I want it to be very lyrical.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. Would you mind reading a little bit from
yes,
most recent
from
book?
Whistle. Yeah, that's Whistle.
This is from the opening?
Yeah. Starting from book 1, and this is, it's written in 2 parts. The first part is Roper, a 54-year-old black man. The second part of the book, her second book, I call it, is Louise, his mother. And in book 1, we're dealing with Roper. He's a black man, 54 years old. He's just gotten out of jail for a crime he did not commit, very much afraid of going back to jail. And he's out mowing the fields with a rotary mower for his white boss and discovers the boss's wife dead out in the fields. He knows he didn't do it, but he knows, by gosh, he may be blamed for this. It starts off very much as classic kind of, just classic murder mystery, and then moves into a story of, it's Louise's story, the mother, who is trying very hard to save the whole world, save her people, she wants her son to be one man who will stand for something good, and she's going to use some blackmail on Roper. But I will read just a couple of paragraphs from Whistle, where Roper is just about to discover the body, or has discovered the body.
Great.
Roper hopes he isn't seeing what he thinks he's seeing, but he is. He knows he is. He hopes it's a roll of navy rags tumbled up by the wind that isn't wind, but a drizzly draft batting through the truck windows. Eyes on the roll of navy at the end of the pond road, he steers the blue Isuzu onto the rough ground of the open field, driving north toward the blue tractor to get on with his mowing, watching till the strand of unmowed weeds blocks his view of the navy rag roll. When he looks again, it will be gone. Surely it will be gone. But when he mounts the tractor and gears it into first, looking again toward the end of the pond road, he is high enough to see over the weeds, and still the roll of navy is there. Not exactly a roll shape, and if he isn't careful, he might conjure the rest of it into the image of a white woman's overlapped arms and legs, driving parallel to the navy in white, what? Rags blown from the old home side on the south end of the property? Yet a good 100 feet away, he heads the tractor east in the direction of the white farmhouse fronting Highway 129. Listening to the hard churr of the rotary mower, the mind-numbing clatter-clack-clack of the tractor, seeing before him the green Volvo in the backyard where he had talked to the boss's wife before going home for lunch. Wearing what? One of those shorts outfits she always wears when she goes out walking every day. What color? He can lie to himself and say red or gray. He can lie to himself and say he never spoke to that white woman in the first place, that he hasn't seen what could be her body side-slung in the sand at the other end of the road, but he has. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Good stopping point.
Yeah, that's great. I love listening to writers read their own work. It's very interesting.
Yeah. It's also kind of scary because after something's published and you go back and you look at it, you think, oh my gosh, I want to change that. And can you go gather up all the books and
never happy with
editing is over then.
Another 25 years when you collect all your works together, you maybe go back and edit them.
Yeah, I don't know.
You probably don't want to do that.
Oh, I'd like to.
Well, you told me that you've been doing some teaching and doing a lot of workshopping with students. What's that like?
I'm writer in residence at Valdosta State University. And mostly what I do is I'll go in when a professor invites me to come and speak to their class. I will talk to them. I also do a lot of writers' conferences. And that's talking mostly with writers. I like to do that. I like to talk with students, but I'm not really a teacher. I wouldn't know how. I'm in awe of teachers that they can do that. It's the true art. I don't have that talent. I can share my experience, and I like to particularly share my experiences with writers, and maybe they can understand that the only way you can not get published if you're working very hard is to quit. You will get published if you're working hard. And I think I particularly was having a hard time with that when I first got published, and I would see aspiring writers in my audience, and they would talk to me, and I would get so sad I had made it. And I wanted them to understand that I was sitting on that front row too. Also, just a few weeks before, a year before, I was sitting there in their place, and I understood exactly what it felt like to pour your heart out and you fall in love with what you've written. And you've done all that you know to do. You've really paid your dues. You have read all that you can read. You have written religiously, and still you're not published. That's a sad thing, but I cannot say enough. You gotta hang in there, and you gotta make connections with that Joyce Carol Oates, with that Fairy Godmother. And don't write to Joyce Carol Oates.
I'm sure she appreciates that.
It's a good place to send a story, though. Ontario Review Press, Ontario Review.
That's good advice.
Beautiful little review.
So when you read another person's work, how do you gauge it, or how do you decide whether it's, goes that extra mile to get published? What kind of things do you look for? In other people's work, what do you say?
I look for their writing.
I
know that a lot of, and I've been told this by editors and agents, they'll open up to the first page of a manuscript, and if it grabs them, they'll keep it. If it doesn't, out it goes. Or they may open to the middle just to see what you write like. Can you write? And there's no way to do that except by writing. That's the only way you learn to write and to have a certain style. You find your own style. You find your own voice. People used to say that to me, and I did not understand it. What did they mean by that? And then I was going through a phase of imitating Welty. I would imitate different writers at different times, depending on who I was reading. That's kind of bad, and it's kind of good, because at least you're writing, and you're learning something from the masters. And I was imitating Welty. And suddenly one day it dawned on me, wait a minute, this is not my voice, this is Welty's voice. And I found my own voice. And that was wonderful, and I've never had that problem since then. And I feel that's something that editors look for, a voice. And my editor at HarperCollins always says that, he said, it's a myth that we don't want to see these manuscripts. We do very much want to see these manuscripts. We want to see something good. We want to discover a new writer. We want to publish something good. And I know this is true all over. It's just that, we're not writing hard enough. Sometimes you have to work a little bit harder. Do like I did, stay up all night.
Stay up all night?
Yes, stay up all night. No, I think we have more time than we think we do, Jim. I hear people say, well, I don't have time, I work, this kind of thing. But how much time are you spending in front of that television, which is absolute murder on the mind? Or
right.
How much time are you putting into other things that, what if you did? What if you wrote 5 pages a day for a year? You'd have a pretty nice novel by the end of the year, wouldn't you?
Sure, that's right. Well, pretty soon people will be saying, why aren't you writing more like Janice Daugharty? Right?
I don't know.
This has been Writer to Writer. Thank you for joining us.